Good morning, Coral. How are you?
I'm wonderful. How are you doing?
Yeah, great, great. Well, it's such a pleasure to talk to you almost live. Our conversations have only been in the Twitter DMs and group conversations so far. It's been purely text. So it's great to see you and talk to you as well.
It's
So,
so exciting.
yeah, thank you for joining this series of Sentientist Conversations. And as you know, in a way, we're focusing these conversations on trying to answer the two deepest and I think most important philosophical questions: what's real and what and who matters. And I have an obvious bias in the way I answer those questions. The clue is in the title, because I'm trying to popularize this very simple pluralistic worldview called Sentientism, which says when it comes to thinking about what's real, let's take a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason. And when it comes to what and who matters, again, the clue is in the name, sentience is what counts. So, any sentient being that has the capacity to suffer or flourish, we should grant them compassion, moral consideration. But I'm talking to people in these conversations who agree and disagree. So it'll be fascinating to understand your own philosophical journey and where you've got to now. So, yeah, it's great to talk.
And this is one of my favorite conversations because it does have wide-ranging repercussions. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, likewise. And I that's partly my motivation behind this thing, right? Because it seems like quite a lot of philosophy can be a bit niche. It can be a bit abstract. And the philosophers reassure me they need to do that work, right? To make sure the technical underpinnings are really rock solid and everything works. But I struggle sometimes to engage in those things. I think sometimes the most basic questions are, the most important. And to be honest, most philosophers have got them both wrong. So you and I can put them right. But I also agree that the implications basically touch everything, right? If it's not about, if you're understanding reality wrong and your moral scope is incorrect or excludes some beings that shouldn't be excluded, that's the root to all problems, right? So, what's real and what is value and what really matters seem to be two central questions that we need to get right. So, and it makes my interviews really easy because I just ask the same two questions over and over and let my guests talk. So,
absolutely.
It's good for a lazy interviewer.
Nobody will ever call you a lazy interviewer.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, before we get onto those two big questions, how would you best introduce yourself and the things you do for people who don't know you?
So for those that don't know me, I'm around the internet as vegan atheist Coral, and I chose that moniker for a very specific reason because I wanted to start conversations. So I would say back in my past, I was certainly like many Americans, I grew up in a very religious household. Mine was a little bit different because we were actually Mormon. So my family is also a military family. My dad was in the Coastguard, and later on, me and my husband also joined the Coastguard. Duty, responsibility was very much built and ingrained into who we were, and that responsibility to care for others, because we say in the Coastguard we save lives, not take lives, and so just that simple mindset of just at the basics, everything in my worldview was about that. And I didn't really quite see that I was being a bit hypocritical. I grew up and I used to embrace the theme of that I was a meat and potatoes girl. And but I still felt that I was a good person. And so through my search of you know, religion and philosophy and even psychology and things like that, I actually kind of slowly pivoted
Yeah.
from being a very religious Mormon person to being someone who is spiritual. And then I moved over and was finally atheistic, where I felt that um, most likely we probably could say that we're agnostic. You can't, the chances that we'll be able to prove definitively whether or not there is a deity or gods is quite low, in my opinion, just for the fact that well, how do you prove God and not God, like it's unanswerable. You can't show me a universe that has a God and a universe that does not have a God so that I can compare the two and determine it. And once I kind of did that, I kind of, it just was a natural progression to like, oh, okay, so what do we actually know then? When I finally became atheist, and I choose that word because of the fact that it starts conversations. I don't tend to be the type of person to proselytize. I want people to come to me that want to have these conversations because I know that they can be they can shake people because that's at the core of their beliefs. And I am okay with shaking people's beliefs, but I want them to be open to those conversations. And most of the time, they're still going to come with their defenses up. This is where I kind of started looking at like the street epistemology and stuff like that to help me with those conversations. Because I also wanted to have conversations that were really respectful of how people are, what those core beliefs are, but get them to also question it because I had a moment where I questioned mine and I felt like that would be something that would be fun for people to do. Didn't realize how much that could mess with people. But then I started having conversations about veganism, and that was one place.
As if you didn't have enough challenges talking about religion.
Right. But a lot of people were starting to point out the fact that I say that I'm a good person and that I love animals, and yet I was eating them, and I hadn't quite made the connection of the compassion and empathy that I share for everything else. I felt like I was still giving it to those animals, especially since I was very deep in. I do animal rescue, and I help out with about 10 different rabbit rescues in the Chicagoland area.
Wow.
And so I remember the distinct moment that I had that switch. And that was while I was doing animal rescue, and some friends came over and started making Hassenpfeffer stew jokes. And I'm like, no, these are fantastic creatures with these amazing personalities, and I get so much joy out of caring for them and helping them. Why would you even joke like that? And that was the start of everything. Like, well, why do I pick dogs and cats and rabbits? Well, why not pigs and cows and even squid and fish? Like what becomes that determining factor? And so I had to go back to scratch again, just like I did with religion, and say, well, what do we really know about this?
Yeah. And so it sounds like, if you would to put this as a sort of life mission, the thing you really want to do is to try and have productive conversations, particularly around those two, deeply important topics. And you do that through YouTube, you do that through your writing, you do that through your online presence. And in addition to that, you're running your own rabbit rescue and volunteering with other rabbit rescues as well. So you're doing some very hands-on direct work too. Is that a good summary of sort of what you're up to now?
A bit. I don't own a rabbit rescue, but okay. I own a bunny boarding business, and I do grooming and things like that. But one of the things that we did as soon as we set up is we knew we wanted to contribute to our community. So we actually give portions of all of our sales to the rescues that we work with. And we've been in the community. We're working on several big things, including some expos and things with veterinarians and the rescues, and hopefully the community will join us as well. So yeah, we definitely have our fingers in a bunch of different things, but yeah, definitely the biggest things is in my writing I feel as a writer, one of the best things, and I guess again, I get this from my childhood. Some of my favorite TV shows were the ones that had morals and ethics and philosophical questions hidden in them.
Yeah, there's a
Uh,
message.
Absolutely. I was definitely a Trekkie growing up. So Star Trek, the original series. Oh, I just remember there's these episodes where there was this guy and he was half white and half black, and the other one was half black and half white, and they were literally fighting to the death. There was literally no one else alive except those two guys from their species, and they still could not get over their anger. So, like, those types of episodes are so fantastic to me. And I wanted to write things that did the same thing to my readers,
Yeah.
where they actually say, well, what about this scenario is making me so uncomfortable? Because we are living our lives doing it. So what those themes
Yeah.
I do put into my stories a lot.
Cool. Well, we'll come back to that because the final question we ask is thinking about the future and ways we can sort of pull levers and make change happen. It will be fascinating to dig into how you try and do that through your writing. The modern day Gene Roddenberry slapping people around the face with ethical messages in your stories. So that'll be good to come back to. And you've given us a great intro to, I guess, how you're going to answer both of these two central philosophical questions, but it'll be good to dig a bit deeper as well. So on the first one of those, what's real? As you said, you grew up in the Mormon faith. And I think you're the first person from a sort of Mormon origin that I've spoken to in this series so far. So for people who aren't familiar with the Mormon faith, it would be really interesting to understand, what that meant to you, what you believed, what were its implications. And then we can come on to the story as to, how and why you started to question that.
Absolutely. I think at the core of Mormonism is they put a lot of emphasis on this is the one true church. This is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And saying those words that very specific way is on purpose. So you don't minimize, the faith. So the books and its doctrine is this is the one true word of God. And you have, like, every Mormon carries around with them the Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price, and their core documents and stuff like that. And so it is something that encompasses every bit of how you live your life. And
yeah, it's not one of those religions like the one I grew up in where it sort of sits in the background and you can sort of drop in a couple of times a year if you like, and it doesn't really drive your life. It is almost the defining essence of the way you and your family and your community live.
absolutely.
Right?
I mean, every Sunday we would go to our Sunday day was church. You spent 4 hours in, just listening to the guy speak, and then after you go to your Sunday school or young women's or whatever, and so you sit there for 4 hours listening to them preach, and then you go to the school section of it where then they again for another hour to 2 hours ingrain that. So you're like spending 6 hours in this religious area speaking on these points, and it really does become your whole essence. And we also had, and that wasn't the only time we went. I mean, we always went on Wednesdays as well. You had meetings that you had to go to, and I just remember most of my childhood, I felt like I was in church.
Yeah.
And they also had a lot of impact in our day-to-day life where, like, for instance, they have a lot of emphasis on family, which is a good thing. Until you have people in your family that don't have the same beliefs, and they're very good at shunning and like doing, it's like a way of ignoring type shunning that can be quite damaging to the people that are now, instead of being in the in group, they are now in the out group.
Yeah.
It's really a tough religion. A lot of internal self-pressure too, because you believe that, you know, you have the Holy Ghost, and, you know, you're constantly measuring yourself against what you think Jesus would want you to do. And it's a lot of pressure for people.
Yeah. And it's quite a modern religion as well, you know, in the context
Yes.
of, you know, Christianity or Islam or, you know, Zoroastrianism or some of the, you know, really ancient ones. And how would you summarize the sort of core essential beliefs, you know, the 5 or 10 things that every Mormon is expected to believe? What are the sort of essential, most important things about reality that Mormons insisted you believe?
Well, the first is that it was established by Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith is, though most people don't know, he was a bit of a treasure seeker, but the Mormons don't believe in about that. They believe that he went out and he found golden plates. Some stories have angel, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 angels, but the angels were the ones that showed him where the plates were, and so he took this golden plates back and he translated them. Some say using the Urim and the Thummim or something like that, or, you know, there's these 2 seer stones that you use, and some believe that he didn't actually use the stones. Some say he looked in a hat and was like looking through the stones. There's other ones where he is just looking in the hat and he wasn't actually looking at the plates. It's very interesting that there's lots of different variations of the story, but the main thing is that Joseph Smith translated these plates, and that later became the Book of Mormon, and then later on they did the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price. So those are the main things that the church believes, and that the people of the church believe. There's
the divine texts.
Yeah, the divine texts, and these are the texts that every Mormon uses to guide their lives. They are, if you have a question about your life, you look to those. And
how do they relate to the Bible of, I guess, standard Christianity?
Well, the question, because of what I know now, I know a lot of the text has been almost like ripped off from the Bible.
Yeah.
So, but most Mormons don't think about that. They think that, you know, you have the original Old Testament, and then you have the New Testament, and then you have the Book of Mormon, and that is the most up to date. That is the
so
one.
It's superseded. Yeah. It's like, okay, we have the new version now. We don't really need to worry too much about.
And honestly, like when I was younger, I never looked at any of the Old Testament or the New Testament. It wasn't until I was probably in my teens that I first started looking at it. And it's not shocking that soon thereafter, I also started looking at my religion and whether or not it was true or not, specifically because of the fact that on the Book of Mormon, when you open up that first page, there's actually some Egyptian hieroglyphs. And I loved Egyptology ever since I was a little kid. So seeing that he was able to translate these into the Word of God was amazing, because back then we didn't know too much about Egyptology and those hieroglyphs and stuff like that. And when I found out that those translations were nothing like what those actually said, that was one of the first little...
Another difficult moment. And on the supernatural stuff, if you like, is most of the rest of it roughly in line with Christianity? So there's one God, there's Jesus as the Son of God, sacrificed for our sins. I guess a sort of creationist timeline or something different, heaven and hell. I don't want to take you through the whole thing, right? But just what are any of the other essential, beliefs that?
It's interesting because there is they do believe in the Trinity. You have God, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Ghost, and they are three in one. That is a very essential core belief of Mormonism. There are multiple types of Mormons. So you have a more fundamentalist Mormons, and then you have more progressive Mormons, I guess you could say. And depending on which tract you follow will depend on whether or not you believe in young Earth creationists or old Earth creationists, because it is very easy in Mormonism to kind of back up your beliefs with God was the one who created this, and it doesn't really matter if it happened in 6 days or in 6 billion years or whatever years it is. The biggest thing that you need to take away from this story is that it was created by God.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, and so it's interesting because there are there's strong echoes of Christianity. In a sense, it is another sort of sect or subset of Christianity, but there's some distinctive differences that flow through as well. And you talked about the the ethical and the practical implications. There's strong ritual, there's patterns, there's worship, there's a really strong focus on the family, but then there's a sharp edge to that as well. And it's an interesting mix because in a sense, one of the things in all of these conversations we talk about is that how there is a rich vein of compassion that flows through most religions, but often it is quite selective, or it's conditional, or it's constrained in some way. And this seemed like another example where there's clearly rich compassion for the family and the community, right? We really care about each other. That's super important, right? So you can see that as a positive, rich, positive flowing thing. I think you can also see with the way Mormons interact with the wider world. Yes, there's proselytization and the expectation that you're going out and spreading the word, and that's an obligation on everyone to participate in, and famous, and everyone sort of knows how that works. But that style of engagement feels quite compassionate as well. It's not hectoring, it's not attacking, it's not threatening. Mormons just are nice, right? When you meet them, they just seem like nice people. And then you've got this other challenge of, if you're in the community and you step out of line, then there's a brutality unveiled, I guess. So yeah, that's sort of my sense of.
Yeah, but Mormons care a lot about how they are perceived, how the church is perceived. So it very much matters how you dress, how you present yourself, who you hang around with. So all of those perceptions, it does not matter if they are true or not. What matters is how people perceive you.
Yeah.
And that is
nice short
important.
haircut.
Yep. Nice short haircuts. You need like the men would of course wear the trousers with the white button down shirt with their with their ties, and it's going to be a black tie. It's not going to be a funky tie. It's the women are going to wear modest clothing. You're going to wear a dress to church or a skirt and a shirt. You are not going to wear pants to church. There's a very, all the way down to how you dress and how you look. Everything is a perception of who you are. And so it is very important when you go out into the world that perception, you are a reflection of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And especially if you're going out, every person that you talk to, you are a representative of the church. And so that's why how you speak and how you interact with people matter as well. And why they also work so hard to make sure that perception of the church is their narrative. and that is one of the main reasons why they take young children and send them off on missions away from their families, and make them go through, and they could be in different countries. They'll be across the United States from where their families are, and they'll go on these missions and proselytize. But what also happens is they're isolated. And because they're isolated, they're able to do some strong reinforcements of what their religious beliefs are.
Is it, I might be overplaying this, but it almost feels like, from the perspective of the institutions of the church, even the parents within the community are seen as a potential threat. There's a risk of some disruption of divided loyalties, of other things creeping in. Hence that, let's separate them, give them the pure message, drive that in, really make sure this is locked down and tightly managed. Is that?
It's not necessarily just the parents. It's also your friends, the friends that you grow up with. Most of the time, if you grow up in a Mormon family, most of your friends are going to be Mormon, but there's also sometimes friends that are in the community that might be your next door neighbor that might not be in the faith. And so there is a big danger that those people can actually give you doubts. And doubts is actually something that is something that is not shied away from with the church, but they have you actually speak and give your testimony. And it is seen like as something that is really good, and they encourage you to share your testimony with other peoples in the church. And I remember being a little girl. I was a little girl going up and sharing my testimony like all the other adults, because I wanted to be just like them, but telling why we believe that Jesus Christ is, or that the church is true, and that the reason why the church is true, and that Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior, and all of those things. Just those words just come out again because you say it so many times. And when you're on these missions, again, you're separated from your friends, you're separated from your family. And so and it is very closely monitored to make sure that there's almost like the other people that you're on the mission with are almost like snitches.
Yeah.
They often talk about whether or not they think someone's having doubts. And when you have doubts, you're supposed to be taking it to the elders and talking to them about it, and, reading your book.
And there's two ways of thinking about that. We should be open about our doubts, right? And you and I would agree with that today. It feels like a constructive, open, positive thing, because we should have doubts and work them through. This doesn't sound like that sort of openness to doubts. It sounds like you're expected to snitch on yourself, and if you have doubts, you're expected to tell us about them so that we can bring you back into line with where you absolutely need to be. So that it's not a free consideration of open-minded thinking about doubts. It's almost snitching on yourself and then getting back in line. Is that unfair, or?
No, I believe it's very much like that. I think some Mormons might feel that that's a little unfair, but it was at least my experience that I felt that pressure. There's a big social pressure to make sure that, doubts are supposed to be okay. So I should be able to say that this is what is really bothering me about the Book of Mormon, is these things. And the church even has, and let me say the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Church, they have on their website a lot of their history. And if anybody has doubts, it's there for anybody to look at. They're not hiding anything. But
it's
chances
almost, it's the presenting this sense of openness as a shield in a way, which is ironic.
Yeah. Because you don't look at it. You don't look at it.
So this is quite an impressive machine, right? When you think about social norms and patterns and frankly, indoctrination and compliance and the pressure, you're pretty weird, right? Because you broke away from it. So what was that process like for you? When did the cracks start to appear, and how did it play out? And I guess we can frame this question in a couple of ways, because with many of my guests, with some of them, it was evidence and reason, and there are inconsistencies in these religious books, and I learned about some of the other religions, and they can't always be true, and the facts just don't make sense, right? This feels much more like a human fiction than, supernatural perfect thing. So it was evidence and reason, right? Facts. For others, they were sort of okay with that. They just sort of accepted it. But there were some ethical and moral things where they're like, this just doesn't feel right. Whether it's homophobia, sexism, racism, anti-Semitism, threatening small children with burning in hell for eternity if they make some mistake. And they're like, hold on, whoever's saying this, right, just doesn't intuitively feel right to me. So there was more of an ethical drive where the crack started. For some, it was both. So yeah, was it?
What
was it for you?
Okay, so mine was I moved. And that sounds weird, but it was an enlightening experience. As I said, I was in the military. And most of the time that I grew up, it was on the West Coast. And the culture of the West Coast is very laid back, California hippie. I was definitely a hippie child. I believed in love. Love bombing was very big for me. I would be the type of child that would go up and sing the Sesame Street song, because I wanted to make somebody smile and bring joy to their lives. And
do you want to do a little rendition now, or is that?
No, I will pass on that. I do not have a singing voice at all.
You could be the first person to sing on Sentientist Conversations.
And
anyway, sorry.
No worries. I hope though that I do. That aspect of my life has not changed. I definitely love to see people smile. So, but I was about, I think, 13 or 14 years old. So a very impressionable age when we moved down south to the Bible Belt, and we moved to Alabama, Mobile, Alabama. And the culture shock was out of control.
I can imagine. Was it like a different country in a way?
It legitimately felt that way. There's so many times where I was just hit a wall of how different I was than the people that I was around. And I'll give a few examples. One of them was, as I said, I was a very hippie, like live and let live. Even as a Mormon, I still believed that, they might be wrong, but I still believed that I wanted people to still accept me and like me and, perceive me as a good person. And then when I got to the school, I went to it was a primarily African-American school. And I was one of 11 Caucasian people. And I got off the bus that first day and walked straight up to the first group of people I saw and was like, "Hi, my name is Coral. How are you?" And they looked at me like I had gone crazy. And I remember one person just looked at me and was like, "Your people is over there." And I was like, "What on earth are you talking about?" I'm like, "You're my people." Because to me, I was like, I don't see color. I don't see, I was so ignorant because in my worldview, racism didn't exist anymore. That was taken care of with Martin Luther King in the 60s.
We're done with that, right?
Yeah. We're done. Yeah. And I had no clue. I had no clue of what I was stepping into. And I looked over at the white kids that was over there, and they looked like they were skater kids. And I'm like, they're definitely not my cup of tea. And I was like, yeah, no, they're not my people. I just moved here and I was just like trying to be friends, and I immediately got caught in a wall and I didn't understand. And then I remember one of the first times we went into the cafeteria for lunch. And one thing that most people might not know about Mormonism is we believed it just hits you. Yeah, it's still in there. We believe that the relationship with Jesus Christ is a very personal one, and that you do not, you know, shout out and force your beliefs on other people. And when I went into this cafeteria, they a lot of the people were not eating yet, and I just sat down and started eating my food, and this girl walked up from behind me and it said, "Excuse me, uh, what are you doing?" And I was like, "Hi, I'm new. I'm eating," you know. And she's like, "We pray here." And I was like, "Cool. Have fun doing that." And she's like, "No, you do not understand. You need to stand. We pray here." And I was like, "I already prayed, but thank you." And she was like, "No." And she yanked me behind and I fell backwards. And I was just like, "What on earth is going on here?" And they all stood, everybody, like as a group, and prayed
Yeah.
loudly.
Said
And
grace.
I was like, what is going on? And I saw so many different things, like, and this was, most of the people down in that area is either Southern Baptist or there's one that starts with a P. I always forget. Protestant, I think. Um, uh, so there's some very big beliefs, and they are just as sure that their beliefs are true. And so I, in all of my wonderful glory and smart aleckness, decided that I was going to go out and prove that my beliefs were true, because I go to the one true church and I read the one true word of God, and they are all wrong. So of
Wow.
course,
What a
because
way
I
to
knew,
introduce yourself to a new school.
right. So I decided to go on a mission to study, but I wasn't just going to, you know, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I started having debates on the bus and other things when people were talking to me, and I'd be like, really? Would Jesus want you to do that? And become this really judgy person about these what I saw, very hypocritical things, where these people would sit there and do drugs, and they would drink, and they would steal and do all types of really horrible things, and then they would go to church on Sunday. And I didn't understand it.
Well, you can wipe the slate clean on Sunday, right? So you can do whatever you like during the week.
Right. Which I didn't believe was true. I was like, there's no way that would be true. You need to be a good person. And that's not being a good person. And so, at least in my mind, of course, but yeah, it was. So I decided in all of my genius that I, at 14 years old, was going to prove that there was not only a God, but that the God that they believe in is wrong, and that I was right, and that the church was the one true church, and all of those things. And so I started studying, and really, really studying not only the Book of Mormon, but then I started reaching out, because I was like, oh, well, maybe all the religions are connected, and maybe that there is, maybe the parts of their religion is true, and they just are wrong about these other bits.
Yeah. They've glimpsed part of the truth, but I need to just correct them on the rest.
Yeah. And then there was a incident, and I don't know, I was young at the time, and I wasn't in on all of the things, but my dad refused to let me go to the church. And, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which I was not. I was like, why? What is going on? Found out later on there were some accusations, and my dad did not feel safe with us going to that church, and that's the reason why. So there was actually another person in Dad's unit that would actually pick me up and drive me to their church, which was in a different ward. We call our region wards.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was only able to go to church with her. And because of that, not going to church every Sunday, every Wednesday, and seeing my parents also pull away and no longer start going, by 16, I was I was studying Buddhism and Taoism and Jainism, and I was just soaking in all of the various myths and histories and things like that.
So you weren't just doing the Abrahamic stuff and Christianity and
No,
Islam. You went to Eastern religions and philosophies as well, and the whole lot.
I was
Polytheism
sure.
and
Yeah, I was sure that there was no doubt in my mind that all of these people believe in something. So there has to be like an ultimate truth or something. The big capital T truth must be out there. And I was starting with a presupposition that God was real.
Yeah.
And I was starting to, as I started searching, I actually stayed in that spiritual sect well on into my 20s.
And so did your parents, in a sense, drift away from or leave Mormonism at the same time? Or did they just have a challenge with that specific church, but they stayed Mormons? Or, because I guess that sets the context for, I've talked to such a wide variety of people, and most of my guests, not all, have left a religious context. And for some like me, it was pretty easy, right? It was a background thing, wasn't particularly challenging. It just sort of drifted away and that was it, right? Moved on. And for other people, it's been psychologically, socially, and sometimes physically dangerous, right, for them to leave that. So where was it on the spectrum for you as you went through that process of shifting from, basically being a Mormon to a more broad sense of spirituality? There's something out there, but I'm no longer a Mormon.
Mom and dad stayed in the Mormon context pretty much until that incident happened. And I'm not sure exactly what had happened, but there was a big break at that point. I stayed Mormon for at least a few more years after that. I didn't, because we weren't in a community like we were in the West Coast, where it was around a lot of Mormons and stuff like that, they were easily able to break off at that point.
Got it. Whereas if you'd done that on the West Coast, the shunning and the disconnection from the community would have been much more traumatic. Whereas where you were,
exactly,
it was less of an issue, right? It didn't define the community you were part of. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. And so they were very easily, but that being said, mom and dad have rejoined in a few times since then, depending on where they live. And my older sister, she and her family are devout, and they have continued. She actually, when I was younger, was a Satanist for most of her teenage years, and she only recently came into Mormonism as an adult.
That's a transition. Yeah. Cool. So you talked about a transition to that sort of sense of spirituality, and it sounds like it was because you were learning about so many different perceptions of God or gods, the religious, the supernatural. You still had this core faith, if you like, that there was some sort of deity or something else out there. You learned about so many different perspectives. You lost your commitment to one particular view, but you still kept that broader sense. So it was one of exploration, I guess, evidence and reason, different perspectives, rather than maybe, pushing back on some of the ethics you saw in Mormonism. Is that fair? It was more intellectual exploration.
Absolutely. It was definitely much more intellectual. I was, as a teen, very big into the sciences. I took and wanted to learn very much. Another Star Trekian, I guess, viewpoint is, the search for knowledge is at the base of who we are as humans. And so I wanted to boldly go wherever that question was going to take me. I was going to go there. And
so this sort of spiritual stage wasn't the end of your journey either, as you've said before. So why didn't you stay there? Because that's quite a comfortable place for many people. And some of my guests, right, they've left a religion because of either ethics or specific rejection of, supernatural beliefs. But this sort of spiritual but not religious space is quite comfortable because, in a sense, you don't have the ethical constraints and the rules and the challenge and the social pressure. You don't have very many specific supernatural things to believe in either, right? So you can say, well, I don't know, I have this sense that there's something, right? You can be nice and vague, so it's quite comfortable. But you still have this warm sense of transcendence and interconnectedness and deeper, richer meaning. So why didn't you stay in that comfortable place?
I'm not sure.
I didn't find it comfortable, but
yeah. I just kept searching, and it felt like I put on a bunch of different hats to see what would fit, and none of them fit right. And I don't know if it's because I grew up with Mormonism, but I just felt like nothing fit right. And I did stay in that space for a long time, because especially when I joined the military, because I didn't want to search anymore. I was like, okay, I don't know what the truth is. I'm probably not going to answer the question that people have been asking for 2,000 years. So let me just, live my life or whatever. And it wasn't really until I hit probably my late 20s that I really started kind of reflecting more on who I was as a person and what I believed and why, especially after some of the beliefs that I had during that time, just not only didn't feel right, but they were so far outside the norm. And I started asking, well, how do we know?
Yeah.
And once I hit that, how do we know what we know? It was hard to get out of that cycle. And I just kind of got stuck in that as a loop. And I was like, what do we know? How do we know it? And, I started especially looking at philosophy a lot. And Brain in a Vat got me stuck for a while.
Yeah.
That one and The Matrix, when that came out in the 2000s, that was another one. Like, I was like, but how do we know we're not in the Matrix?
It's properly mind-blowing stuff, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I was stuck there for a bit. And I think that, digging into those philosophical questions helped me move the rest of the way out, because I was finally able to say, you know what? I don't know if I'm a brain in a vat or if I am just a cog in the matrix. I can't know that. But what do I know? I know that I'm interacting with other people. I know that I have sensory, senses and touches, and I can sense these things. My brain is able to calculate and to make decisions off of those things. And so I just that's where I was like, well, if we look at the basis of what we know and what we don't know, we really, that's when I started looking at the God question. And at that point I was like, well, I don't think I can know that. I certainly could spend the rest of my life looking, but I don't think that would behoove me at this point, because of the fact that, as I said, I don't have a universe with a God and without a God, and how am I to compare the two?
And when it comes down to it, there are a practically infinite number of things for which there's no good supporting evidence. So why would you pick that one to spend a load of time on? So
yes.
That may seem a little dismissive, but that's sort of where I've ended up. I've got to the point where, I think you and I are probably in a similar place on the God point, in that, people talk about different definitions of atheist. It's a term I'm pretty comfortable with, but, technically maybe we're extreme agnostics, where, we still leave, a little bit of wiggle room open. As good naturalists, if there's new evidence, great, I'll listen to it.
Yeah.
But it's, for me, it seems vanishingly unlikely, along with, as I said, a functional infinite of other things people have just made up.
Right. I feel like if it's a specific God, I feel like I'd feel comfortable saying, no, I'm definitely atheistic about, say, the Abrahamic gods. But if we have, say, but I don't know, there might be something out there that I don't know. So, and when it comes to like deism, it's like, well, if you're going to call the universe God, then why don't we just call it the universe? We have a word for that, so.
And that does seem to be the endpoint of some philosophical debates, where it's more about the semantics and the meaning of the word. We're no longer really discussing the nature of reality anymore. We're just putting slightly different labels on things and fighting about those labels. And so that's an interesting journey, because when I centered this conversation really about this sort of question about naturalism being an approach where we use evidence and reason to try and understand things. And obviously a religion and the question of God is a central one that people go for, right? Because a naturalistic approach, I think, leads you, or should lead you, to extreme agnosticism or atheism. But were there any other things outside religion and God that fell away at the same time? Were you, or are you still into souls and spirituality and astrology? And, was there some other sort of stuff that isn't to do with religion that you've either kept or left behind at the same time?
When I was spiritual, I believed in all of that stuff, and but when I started, I would say, into my atheism, I was looking at, well, what do we know and how do we know it? Those things easily fell away because the supporting evidence is, minimum. And so it was not hard for a lot of that stuff to go away, but I still kept on like a lot of my beliefs, like the fact that I was a meat and potatoes girl. That aspect was core to who I was, my
sort of
culture,
identity stuff.
Yeah, it was me, and I already stripped the religion from me, and this was something that I really held on, even though I had some doubts about that even early on, because one of my closest friends is vegan, and
I see. Yeah.
she was a huge influence later on in my life.
Well, let's come on to that second question, because that's been fascinating to understand your sort of journey on epistemology and Mormonism to atheism. And one of the challenges that some people who move into a naturalistic worldview find is that, whether or not, they were unfounded, they were poorly justified, they were sometimes bad, right? But there was actually an ethical system you got in Mormonism or Christianity or Islam or whatever, right? There were rules, there were cultural norms, there were rituals, lists of things to do, a perfect deity that was supposed to, what would Jesus do, as you said, right? So you have all of that stuff. And I would argue that most of it is arbitrary and unfounded and often goes off the rails and undermines compassion. But, there's some good bits in there too. Fine. But whatever it is, you've sort of left that behind. So what the hell do we do now with, ethics and morality? And there's obviously the trope that, atheists can't be moral. So we're running around pillaging and killing at random just to satisfy our own whims because we cannot be moral without a deity to punish us, of course. But in reality, there is still that process of sort of reconstructing or building. So there's two crazy questions here, but I think important ones. The first one is, what is morality? What is it grounded on? Because if we don't have a God to judge and punish, what is morality? What is good and bad? What is right and wrong? And then the second question, which you've hinted at already, because it'd be fascinating to understand, because I think is another really weird journey here. You've broken out of another set of social norms, is that question of moral scope and compassion, and how people have gone through a journey of, family, maybe thinking about the wider human species, humanity overall, and breaking that boundary and thinking about non-humans, and your journey to veganism as well. So there's two questions there, the foundations of morality and then that journey of moral scope expansion.
I think in the beginning, I was like, I am in a society where we have rules. And since I was in the military, I was very good at sticking to, this is the law. This is your duty as your civic duty to your community. So I didn't really think about that morality question. But until I got to my atheism. And at that point, I started also, I was actually in college during this time, and we were taking a class, and someone had mentioned about some studies that were being done on animals and how they were working together, how these animals were working together in order to as a social species and getting things done. And I thought that was so fascinating because I was like, well, if elephants can do that, and we know that dolphins are very smart, in some cases smarter than some humans, then, and our dogs, we know that they're very smart. And I remember watching a big documentary on dogs and how people had from ancient times, brought these wolves and bred them and, changed how they were. And I saw that change. And I was like, these dogs have started this social contract with these people unknowingly, but they've kept it going. And it seemed to me that was that social contract, which is not something that you like physically say, I accept this contract and I will do this and that. But right, and you sign your name to it. Like that's not something that happens, but yet we still see time and time again these stories of these animals saving another animal from drowning, or whatever it is. Or and like as I said, these there was also a study on gorillas, I think, and what they and how they do their hierarchies. And I started studying like these various animal hierarchies and stuff. And when I say studied, I mean very lightly. But I just kind of looked into these things and these various documentaries that I could find. And
you just get this sense that there's, morality isn't just a human thing. There's at least a proto-morality in animals a long time before we came on the scene.
And I was starting to see that there was compassion. And I knew that gorillas were, obviously we have a shared ancestry with the great apes. And so I knew that just from, our science background and stuff like that. And I said, well, if we can see that in other animals that are not in a shared ancestry of, what could be primates or whatever, then does that mean that it is something that is inherent because of the social nature of the animal? And I kind of dug around that for a while.
Yeah. And I was really lucky to interview Frans de Waal, who's done some of the seminal works. I can't remember which episode number, but if you dig back through the back catalogue, I was lucky enough to talk to him about that sort of moral agency within the non-human world.
Absolutely fascinating stuff, and I highly recommend it to anybody that might be interested.
But there's a challenge there though, because many people share that fascination with non-human animals as moral agents, right? They care for their young, they care for their tribe and their pack, and there can be altruistic behavior and cooperation. So that's saying, oh wow, non-humans can be moral agents.
Yep.
A lot of people don't then make the link to them being moral patients too. So how did that play out for you?
Well, there is a few different times, and I think again my Mormonism kind of helped me get there, because I felt like people were judging me at a certain point in my life, which sounds really
as you mentioned,
weird. But I remember there was a few different incidences that really like made me kind of like, whoa, maybe I need to explore this about myself, because maybe I'm wrong. I mentioned before my best friend is vegan, and she was always she's always been really awesome. And she again doesn't really proselytize her veganism. She's not a big activist as a vegan, although she does also do rescue. We both kind of fell into it around the same time. But she ended up getting married, and I went to her wedding, and we were standing there, and she was having a vegan wedding, and me and her brother at the time, and I think her dad, were joking about how we wanted to leave the wedding to go get a burger.
Yeah. Yeah. And you could feel your protein levels just dropping away.
Right. And the look on her face was just, it hurt me so much.
Yeah.
And and it just kind of jerked me back. And I was like, oh, that was a really, really crappy thing to say. And but I still didn't change. I kept on going. But
meat
then
and potatoes girl.
Yep, I was a meat and potatoes girl. Nothing was going to tell me any different either. But then I started following a few vegans online at the time, and then I remember we had a group from India come in. I was working a 9 to 5 in an office, and we had a group from India come in, and there was one person that was vegetarian. And we were driving in the car one day, and I told her we were going to a restaurant, and I told I said, don't worry, they have lots of food for you to choose from and stuff like that. And then I turned to the person in the front seat and said, don't worry, there's real food there too. And again, I felt that in my soul because I looked back and I met her eyes, and she kind of turned to the person next to her and goes, real food? Really? Like, really? And I was like, I
It's
felt
deep-seated,
that.
isn't it? It's really deep-seated.
Yeah.
It's
You don't realize it, but it kind of made me jerk back, and I was like, wait a minute. But it then there was a person on my Twitter feed who legitimately was just asking questions, and they post various questions about morals and ethics. And one of the questions though that they had asked that day is, when you think of veganism, what word comes to mind? And I thought about it, and I was like, moral. And if that's the case, then why aren't I? Why aren't I why aren't I vegan? If I want to be a moral being, then how is it that I believe that I'm moral, but that veganism in and of
and it's
itself is?
interesting you didn't answer annoying, irritating, preachy, aggressive.
Yeah,
You went
because
with moral, right?
yeah, because
Which
most of the people, the vegans that I saw weren't like that. I did not have most of the vegans that I had met were in real life, not on the
yeah,
internet.
that helps if they're not on
Yeah,
Twitter. Yeah.
yeah. Because
Even
I
I'm
wasn't.
nicer when I'm not on Twitter.
Yeah. I think the millions of people that are, vegetarian and vegan, most people just want to live their life. And most of them would rather like cut their own throats than, impede their self onto other people. It just, at least the ones that I knew, they legitimately did not want to oh, okay, yes, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
vegan. I'm sorry.
It's weird, isn't it? Isn't it tragic that you sort of feel that pressure to be apologetic and quiet about it, because there is a tension between that. That's the normal social pressure, right? If you're trying to change a social norm, there's enormous pressure to say, be quiet, stay in your place, keep your head down, do what you want to do, but don't talk to me about it. Versus the raw truth of what we see as an ethical horror, right?
Yeah.
And a responsibility to speak up and do something about it. It's one of the eternal challenges, I guess, within the whole movement, and anyone who thinks about this deeply.
But what really helped me become more of an advocate of the animals was to get my ethics and morals in line. And when I looked at it and I made that thing, like I would, if I saw someone being raped or murdered, I would want to stop that, because I would want someone to do what they could to stop it if it was happening to me.
You intervene, you step in, right?
Yeah. And that is not considered extreme. That is not considered being pushing your beliefs onto someone else. You're just stopping. You're helping a victim.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that's central for me, is that sense of recognizing that there are victims in this process, right? And as soon as you do that, as you do with human ethics, right? That's the essence of human ethics. You consider the perspective of the other, particularly the victim. You think about them seriously, imagine what it would be like to be them. And as soon as your moral scope extends to include certainly farmed animals in that, it's become so crystal clear. It's so clear. But unless you can recognize that those victims are actually victims that exist, you remain stuck by all the social norms we're so used to.
It really does.
So was that, and once you answered that question, you said, right, I think vegan, I think moral. That's because, okay, it is moral. Was it then a hard transition practically and socially to do that, or was it sort of quick and easy, and your friend was helping you, and you just, woke up vegan in the next morning? Or
yes and no. Okay, I definitely did not wake up vegan the next morning. Because I was a meat and potatoes girl, I also could not cook. I had no idea what I was doing. And I remember maybe for a few days I was vegetarian, and I just started choosing not to order the beef and not order the chicken. And I started ordering black bean burgers more, but I would put cheese on it. And I was like, I know I'm weird. And like whenever I would order that. And so that kind of helped because then again, I felt like I had that judginess there. And so in the end, I legitimately said, I'm going to learn how to cook because I cannot stand like ordering and trying to figure out like, because I felt like these people would be judging me for what I was ordering. And I didn't want to make something super complex and, oh, I'm going to order this, but without this and this and this and this, and then add this, 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 and this. And I'm going to learn to cook. And if I'm going to learn to cook, I'm going to learn to cook without animals and just see where I land. And maybe I'll still eat out with it or not or whatever, but let me just see if I could go, a meal. And then I had 2 recipes, and then I had 3, and then I went out and searched for like, because I had work, I was like, well, what can I do for work? I mean, can I even eat sandwiches? Like, I didn't know. I had no idea. I was so ignorant. I didn't reach out to my best friend during this time either. I did not.
You were doing it yourself. Yeah.
I was doing it completely myself because, again, I felt like I would be judged. And I was so scared to ask for that help. And I didn't use any vegan websites. I just was like doing it myself. And and then I've learned, like 6 months into it, I learned about veganuary. And because it was in the summer that I started, and about 6 months later, veganuary started, and I got so much resources. And I was like, oh,
this is what I should have been doing.
Yeah, this would have made things so much easier.
Yeah, cool. No, that's great. Thank you. So, and philosophically, you went from, I guess, a scope of moral consideration before that was, I guess, pretty average, right? You cared about other humans. You did also care about animals in a sense, right? You hadn't made that connection to farmed animals and so on. And then you broke through that barrier. Another reason why you and I are both pretty weird in a good way, as with most of my guests. Would you say that your moral scope is defined now by, because one of the things I'm guilty of in these conversations, I love leading the audience and sort of asking closed questions that imply they can only give one answer, but I'm going to do it anyway. You went from, humans to, I guess, the animal kingdom, but you mentioned compassion and seeing the perspective of the other and the victim. Is it sentience that defines your moral boundary, that capacity to suffer and flourish? Is it, they overlap pretty well, actually. Is it the animal kingdom? Or some people go beyond that. Some people will say, look, biocentrism or ecocentrism, where they say, look, even plants warrant moral consideration, or rocks and rivers and trees and ecosystems and so on.
And our planet, I think that we have a duty, as if we believe that we are this civilized thing, this being that is so civilized, then I feel like we have a moral obligation as caretakers to take care of the other animals, plants, and bio around us. And right now we're not. As humans, we are consuming. All we do is we're just consuming as much and as quickly as we can. And that is, if we don't do anything, going to kill us and kill everything else around us. And I kind of built I actually have a motto that I live my life by. And that is, when given multiple options, try to use the least shitty option.
Yeah. And it's not a bad rule. Yeah.
By judging that metric, it helps you make all types of decisions. And that doesn't matter if when you choose to make an action or even choose to make an inaction, each thing can have a consequence. And thinking about those consequences, that is what I think most people are missing right now in their day-to-day lives. All they're worried about right now is living their lives, right? And going to work, school, whatever, and surviving. But we have a unique privilege where we can take that extra time to consider the other things and how our impact is felt around us in the world.
Yeah.
And so,
and I think there's an interesting distinction, because I think even so I have quite a strict sentientist view, or sentiocentric view, which is that ultimately all value comes back down to the experience of sentient beings, suffering, flourishing, life and death. That is all that matters. Now, what that means in practical terms is I also care very richly about the biosphere and the ecosphere in this planet we live on, because those things are super important to all the sentient beings that live on it. But I would say that's slightly different from thinking that, a carrot or a rock or a river intrinsically has moral value, because I don't think they can experience anything. So I think those things are important in the context of sentient beings, but I don't think, and that's one of the bugbears I bang on about in a lot of these conversations, is it feels like the modern environmental movement has gone, I'm now more ready to grant rights to a rock or a river or a mountain than I am to a factory farmed pig that actually has the capacity to experience suffering. And I'm like, how did you conclude that, right? They think you think cutting a carrot is morally equivalent to cutting a pig. I'm like, surely even if you want to go beyond sentience, you still have to recognize that suffering does matter in its own right, doesn't it, in any moral system? But apparently not, right?
I think there's definitely a utilitarian view in my views. I think that there is a hierarchy of it. I would give something more moral acceptance, and if it is something that does have sentience, because
so we'll put that on a different level.
Yeah, I think everything has its own level, and that's why my motto is try to choose the least shitty option. And you do have to consider those things. You have to consider, okay, what impact is this going to have on it, on me, on our community, and on everything. And by assessing each one of those categories, we can then make a determination of which action or inaction is the least shitty.
Yeah, makes sense. So that's really helpful. Thank you. So you talked us through your sort of journey on the moral side. Your scope of moral consideration, if you like, goes beyond sentience, but you do offer a particular level of distinctive grading or privilege, if you like, for sentient beings that can suffer within that structure. Yeah, makes sense.
Absolutely.
And before we move off this what matters topic, and we talked briefly before we started recording, that I think we share this frustration that most moral philosophy, and I'm an amateur in the field, right, so I don't academically know it all, but my sense of most moral philosophy, when you read the papers, you listen to their ideas, you learn from podcasts about these great moral philosophers, nearly all of them seem to start with this basic assumption, which is that only humans matter. That's it. And there are exceptions, of course, important exceptions, but that's the center of gravity of most moral philosophies. It's only humans, right? So the percentage of papers or thinking where you'll find any mention of non-human sentience and its moral significance is pretty small. But that also almost gives us an opportunity as well, because there's quite a lot of moral philosophy work that is really clever and intelligent and well thought through, and they've, worked this stuff out that you can adapt really easily if you just find the word human and replace it with sentient being. And then, actually quite a lot of those moral systems can apply. And you had a particular idea around John Rawls's veil of ignorance that I know you've done some work on. So yeah, it would be fascinating for you to sort of firstly talk us through what that veil of ignorance is in the original sense, and then how you think we should adapt it.
Absolutely. John Rawls is he had a very unique and interesting philosophical question. And it was in a form of a thought experiment called the veil of ignorance. And its purpose was...
And I think, I can't remember the name, but I think he actually borrowed the idea from another philosopher whose name I can't remember, which is really embarrassing. But it's become Rawls's thing because he developed it.
But yes, absolutely. And I can't think of the name of the person as well.
I'll have to put it in the show notes if I find
it. Yes, absolutely. Please do. But his veil of ignorance was for justice, right? Is to consider what makes a just or a fair society. That was his question. And so it was very broad. And what it is that you, the person, is you are helping design this society. And the thing about this is you don't know where you're going to end up being in the society. So if you decide to create a society of slaves and masters, you may end up being a slave or you may end up being a master. You don't know. And so by putting that veil of ignorance over, of not knowing where you're going to end up being in that position in that society, then therefore you're much more likely to create a society that is fair and just.
Yeah. It's almost like a more sophisticated example of the thing I've done with my kids, where if there's a vegan donut and they're going to need half each, you get one to cut and the other one to choose. And then it sort of forces fairness.
Yeah. Absolutely, because you don't know which end you're going to end up being. And when I read about that, it was right in the core area of when I was determining my veganism. And I just had a thought at that time, and I said, well, what if you didn't know if you were going to end up being a cow or a pig?
Yeah.
What if you didn't know if you were going to be a person or a fish? What would you then choose as?
So you put you obscure species behind the veil as well. Yeah.
Yes. And by doing that, I have found that the people, when I ask that question, their speciesism kind of drops as well.
Yeah.
Because nobody wants to be. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are some people that are like, well, I guess if there was vampires, then we could sign up to be it. And I was like, okay, but not really, because you would then know that you are a human and that you're choosing that. So it doesn't really work. But I think that it's a interesting philosophical question and something that I am actually hoping to explore more, because I think that it's going to end up leading to some very interesting answers. And my hope is that I'll be able to grab a bunch of people, whether they be vegan or not, and legitimately put them in a room where they are choosing a society and see what they come up with. If they know that if they don't know whether or not they're going to be a pig or a person, and see what the results are. I think it'll be really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm an amateur, but it looks like there's been some fascinating work done by people with a animal-focused ethical stance to try and develop those ideas as well. So there's a guy called Mark Rowland. His work's been challenged and adapted by another guy called Gary Varner. I think another one was Dombrowski, but there's a bunch of other papers that have tried to sort of develop and work on this as well. So if you're interested in some more, academic stuff behind it, I've got some references I can point. But I love that idea of putting people in a room and actually, doing the thought experiment with them. Yeah.
And actually, I got this again from when I grew up. I remember watching the Tyra show, of all things. And she used to do these experiments all the time where she would put someone that's skinny in a fat suit and make them walk down the world and see how different it feels. Or she put makeup on a white person and do a full prosthesis and make them look African American, and then have them go shopping.
Empathy, actually put you in the perspective of the other. Yeah.
And I feel like if something like that is done, then maybe we might be able to get more people to make that connection as well. And I don't know if it will or not, but I think it would be fun to see what happens.
Yeah. Well, that's a nice connection on to the final question we like to ask, which is how can we make a better future? And I guess part of my motivation behind focusing on these two questions is that it seems to me that almost every problem we're facing, particularly the human-caused ones, when you chip away at it, you work out what's underneath that. Why is that happening? Why are we doing that? It's either because we've had a failure of compassion in some sense, right? We're excluding some suffering beings from moral consideration. They might be humans, problems of tribalism that we're facing and discrimination, which, we still have a long way to go on. Absolutely applies to non-human animals. So we're just excluding beings that we should not exclude from our moral consideration. So that's one problem. The other one is just getting shit wrong, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Either because, that we're believing things that are fabricated or made up, that we made up or that someone else made up, and that just don't correspond with reality, or that we're being a sort of pretend naturalist where we'll only listen to the evidence that supports what we already want to believe, or we'll only do the sort of reasoning that leads us to where we already are, rather than being a proper naturalist with open-mindedness and humility, exploring evidence, developing reason, trying to challenge our own biases, look for our blind spots, and believe probabilistically and provisionally. Anyway, so it seems like if every problem either comes down to we've just got shit wrong, or we've had a failure of compassion, that's part of the motivation behind trying to persuade people to commit to naturalistic epistemology and a sentiocentric compassion that doesn't exclude any suffering being. So if we can persuade 7.8 billion people to become sentientists, we'll solve all the world's problems. So through podcasts and YouTubes and
of course
and Facebook groups, of course, that's the power. Right, I should stop lecturing and ranting now. But I do think they're important planks for thinking about making the future better. They're not sufficient. You have to build loads of other stuff on top of that, and there's still so many different things to fight about. But they seem sensible foundations, right? Engage with the reality honestly to try and understand it with humility, and at least all suffering beings should matter as we work out what to do. But nearly everybody on the planet disagrees with us, despite the fact that they seem quite self-evident, right? So, and it's interesting that, there are many people who disagree with both. There are many people who disagree with one but not the other. And sometimes those people are even more frustrating. That's the people who have a sentiocentric compassion. They're maybe vegan, they're animal advocates, they genuinely care, but they still believe a load of crazy shit that's totally unfounded in evidence. And then even more frustrating, I find, is the atheists, the humanists, the skeptics, the rationalists, for whom non-human animal ethics is like kryptonite. Right? So these people are so proud of the fact that they've used evidence and reason to break challenging indoctrinations and social norms, to turn away from harmful traditions, to find a more compassionate way forward. But they still can't get animal ethics. I mean, it blows my mind.
Won't. Yeah, they won't, or they can't. They're just not at that point. They're at the point of where I was when I was a meat and potatoes girl.
Me too, right? And in a way that can help us engage with compassion, because we can remember who we used to be, right? We weren't bad people. We were just, we were just blind to a different set of blinkers. But I guess I find it doubly frustrating with that community because they're so proud of the fact they see their own blind spots, except for this one.
And it's certainly something that, we have, we've fought against, haven't we, with on Twitter and things like that.
Work in progress.
It's definitely going to be hard, but I think that's why we need all of the various voices. Why doing things like this podcast is so important is because you never know what is going to end up being that light bulb for somebody else. You don't know what topic is going to light that fuse, and it's one of the main reasons why I put veganism and all of those things into my writing, is because if we can get people, when they are being entertained and stuff, to be thinking about these things in a different way, in a different context, then they might be much more inclined to think about it in the greater context, because of the fact it's not somebody that's just trying to proselytize to them. It's having the conversations, it's reading about it in an entertaining way, it's getting them in different ways, because, as I said, we never know what's going to stick.
Yeah. And you've hinted again at a bunch of the different visions for the future we might have. And I'd guess that you, as well as some of my guests, if I asked you for a sort of utopian vision, you might refer to Star Trek again, which many people come back to as like, that's where we could be, right? Intellectually curious, scientifically minded, compassionate, and vegan as they were, right? They had
cultured be lovely?
Meats. Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
Wouldn't it be lovely?
But then again, you also work very hands-on, with your volunteering with shelters and actually helping animals in that way, and through your business too. But your idea of using writing as an influence, I think, is really interesting to me as well, because I've done some amateurish writing myself, but it tends to be the proselytizing, right? It's banging people over the head with the message and going, look, this is bloody obvious, you have to agree with me, which it probably isn't that useful. So yeah, how do you go about that in your writing of to entertain and make people think and so on, but feeding in some of these messages that you enjoyed from the TV programs you watched as a kid, where there is there's a moral, there's a message
Yeah, I think it's just kind of coming up with fun ways to have these thought experiments. Sometimes I'll have a book that's just about Plato's cave, and where it's legitimately Plato's cave, and they are searching their way out, and just getting them to think about these philosophical questions through the characters, and getting people to connect, number one, with the characters, because they're not going to connect with any of your themes or underlying moral stance and ethics or anything along those lines if they do not connect with the characters. But I also don't like to put a bunch of things all at once, into it. So I might have, in one story, have someone who already has chosen to be vegan, and maybe in another one they enter into a society that is much like me, going to Mobile, Alabama, and they had a struggle with this new life and dealing with the new culture. These are all stories that other people who have moved multiple places can relate to. And so finding the ways that we can relate and have empathy and compassion towards those storylines, we can then merge them into these stories and create these wonderful thought experiments for people to actually bring forth into their everyday lives.
Yeah, I love it. And as you say, you never quite know where the ripples may end up, and the webs of influence you might have on your readers, and then they might have on other people as well. I like that sense of, on the one hand, can sometimes feel a little frustrating. It's a big world out. What can we do? Right, we're just a small part. But I think we can reassure ourselves with, you never quite know where those ripples will end up. So just keep sending them out and see what happens.
As a child, I remember watching Captain Planet, and that has definitely lasted until now, of why I am environmentally, inclined. And so, you watch things like Fern Gully and, maybe Avatar and, these other entertainments, and they stick into the back of your mind. And then later, when you're looking back after you've already made it, you're like, oh, these are all things that have helped me get to the point of where I am. And I think fundamentally understanding that it really does change how you approach things. I'm not going to hit people over the head with a sledgehammer, because that's not going to work. We know this already, as we were meat eaters back in the day. We know how irritating that is. But there's a place for some people to be that way. So that way we can see exactly, hey, this maybe isn't how I want to be as a person. And
I think, and it's something I'm not particularly good at myself, and I do struggle with it, because I tend to be a little bit more like, here's the answer. Let's engage in a technical discussion, and then everyone will agree with me, right? And so I'm like, well, why do I need a story? Why do I need a narrative? And it's bloody obvious. You need a narrative. You need a story. If you want to hook people, you want to help people think in creative ways. So, I get a little frustrated when, Yuval Noah Harari, for example, who I think is another suspected sentientist, right? Because again, he's vegan, he has a naturalistic worldview and so on. But he talks about the importance of stories and narratives. And I'm like, okay, no, I do agree, right? We do need the stories and narratives, but let's just be clear about the stories that are grounded in reality, the ones that are deliberately fiction, and the ones that are fiction but people believe in. And maybe that's my nervousness about narrative, but I think you can be clear about what's fiction and what isn't. That's not hard to do. And
absolutely.
You can also wind real world themes and messages into really compelling stories. And one of my previous guests, Howie Jacobson, said he's like, that's one of my hesitations about sentientism in a way, right? It's just evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. I mean, great, right? Who could disagree with that? It's sort of obvious. But we need the stories, we need the narrative, we need something that will engage people beyond that. And I totally agree, right? It's not enough just to have a sort of philosophical platform. You've got to do what you're doing, which is, weave a story and
reach people where they are.
Yeah.
I mean, if people didn't do the same for me, I don't think I would have made those steps. I would have still been the meat and potatoes girl, bashing my head against it, because, people but it was the people to take that time, and I had lots of questions, and to answer those questions, and to not be judgy. I think it's hard sometimes when we do think that we have the answers, to not come off as condescending or judgy or things like that. And that's something that I tried to be very conscientious of. But again, that's probably because of my upbringing.
Yeah.
But
Those themes are still there. But I think that's an important part of, if we're going to be serious about universal compassion for all sentient beings, that includes people we disagree with on Twitter, and that includes ourselves as well. And those can be difficult things to do. Sometimes we can be so compassionate about the plight of farmed animals that can lead us to, act in non-compassionate ways with our fellow humans. And it's understandable why,
Yes.
right? But is it really helpful? And is it really the best moral approach too?
Exactly. Because again, you have to think about it in a utilitarian aspect. Will this get us to where we need to be? I think that having compassion and empathy is going to get us to where we want to be faster than not.
Yeah. So how, I want to respect your time because I've run over a load already. How does that leave you feeling overall about our prospects for the future? Do you feel optimistic, pessimistic, somewhere in between?
I look at it like when people ask me about it, and I'm going to take a little bit of a journey, but when I think about veganism and the other things, I just think about how smoking. How did smoking happen, right? We had millions and millions of people smoking, and then slowly over the decades, we found out the dangers of it, and it slowly weaned out. So I don't know if we will ever see it in our lives where the majority of people are vegans, are sentients, but I feel like we're at least going to be helping make the awareness, so that way the journey will then we will be in there. But there's still probably going to be meat eaters, later on in it. There's going to be people that regardless are going to do what they want, and they're not going to care about the moral considerations at all. And I don't know if there's anything we can do about that. But
yeah, I mean, we have those problems for people who think that way about humans as well. And then ultimately we do use the law to constrain them, to prevent them from doing harm. So who knows, one day.
Maybe, but I don't know if it would be within our lives. But I do think that there is a possibility of it happening, because I think that as we grow as a society, it feels like it's the natural response to those questions. But I think we're going to take many steps back before we can step forward.
Yeah. And do you think as we push forward on the non-human animal agenda, that is positively correlated with problems in human ethics, negatively correlated? Like there's a trade-off, we have to choose where to focus, or are they independent things in your mind?
To me, they're the same. I think of myself as a feminist. I think of myself as someone who is, I guess, progressive. And I feel that they are in line with it. We want people to not be abused, and we want them to have the same rights. And so I'm fighting for all the same things. I'm just saying I want these other considerations as well. So I feel like it's the same fight regardless. And when people are going to look back, they're going to look back and see that. But I think it's going to be hard to get, freedom and consideration when we haven't done that for humans. So there is a little bit of a step.
Yeah,
we have
makes
to
sense
take.
to me. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been fascinating getting to know you, and thank you so much for sharing your journey. You give me a lot of hope for the future as well, because there's something in the zeitgeist at the moment that, everyone's locked in a tribal dogma. No one will change their minds, whatever the evidence, whatever the reasoning. But you have, changed your mind on probably two of the most contentious, socially indoctrinated topics there are. So, much hope for the future if the ripples from your writing can spread out and more people will follow your lead. So it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
And the pleasure is all mine as well. It's been such a joy.
What's the best way of people following you, learning more about your work, reading your writing on Wattpad, and watching your videos on YouTube?
Oh, yes. Those are the ways to get in touch with me. I'm on Twitter. I'm on YouTube, definitely making videos. You can also find me on World Anvil. I'm hoping to create some stuff with the Veil of Ignorance on World Anvil soon, so worldanvil.com. I hope that you'll be able to put some of those links on the description. But
Absolutely.
yeah, I hope that everybody will join us in on the conversation.
Yeah, here's to more productive conversations. Yeah.
Let's hope.
Thank you so much again. Take care, and I'll let you get on with the rest of your day. It's been a pleasure.